Hajime Kashimo finally went up against Ryomen Sukuna. It's been almost 50 chapters since we've been foreshadowed to this matchup, and it's currently happening as of chapter 237. I've already made an entire video months ago covering the versus battle between both of these sorcerers from the past, but this video is going to be a little bit different. In this video, I'll be going over why exactly Kashimo is going through these insane lengths just for a fight with the King of Curses, where he's already resigned himself to die even if he wins. Why exactly Kashimo's not willing to only die right now, but why he gave up his other life 400 years ago just for the possibility of smoke and a fight with someone stronger than himself in the future to reach a greater understanding of himself and what it truly means to be strong and manifest reaching insane levels of power in Jujutsu Kaisen. If you would enjoy more JJK content like this, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and comment on some video ideas you want to see be done down below. To first really understand Kashimo, we're gonna have to understand his motivation and mindset behind his drive for power and reaching stronger opponents, even if it means giving up his own life. It's important to remember that Kashimo is not a modern day sorcerer, and what that means is that his way of life and will to live is powered by something completely different compared to those around him like Yuta Okkotsu or Yuji Itadori. Before entering the Culling Games, Megami mentions to Yuji that some of the participants are actually from the past, and he says that what that means is that they valued life completely differently. In the past eras of Jujutsu, taking a look at sorcerers from over 1,000 years ago like Kenjaku, Ryomen Sukuna, and even Yorozu, they all lived in a way that's completely foreign to the world that exists today. But Megami says that even the sorcerers from 100 or 200 years ago, they also valued life completely differently. Fighting to the death was a completely normal thing, and it's in fact what they desired. It's also what Megami thinks drove most of the participants to join the Culling Games in the first place, and Kashimo is by absolutely no means an exception to that idea. Kashimo lived out his past life only 400 years from the modern day. The only other sorcerer that we know of from this time period is Ryu Ishigori, and they're similar in more ways than one. Ryu lives to satisfy his hunger, and what Ryu is hungry for is a battle that can satisfy his desire for fighting. But only so few, even in the modern day, could ever give Ryu the satisfaction he's needed for over 400 years. It's those few that Ryu picks to actually sit down at his table and fill up his empty stomach with power that's only reserved for those who are stronger than himself. That's the reason he mentions to Oro that unlike Yuta, she's not actually invited to sit back down at his table. It's only after Oro lost her arm that Ryu decides that she doesn't actually belong here after all. Ryu thinks to himself that even with reverse curse technique, repairing an arm is still going to be extremely difficult. Ryu's not thinking of the possibility of Oro repairing back her arm because he's worried. He's realizing that Oro losing that arm made her weak enough to easily be kicked out of the dining room. At that moment, Oro lost any potential that she had for satisfying Ryu, and all that was left was Okkotsu. Kashimo is just like Ryu. They both won't stop fighting until they reach the strongest sorcerer with the most potential to satisfy their desire. When Kenjaku first offered Kashimo the opportunity to join the Culling Games 400 years ago, Kashimo's first question was about the strongest sorcerer Kenjaku knows. It's only when Kenjaku mentions that Sukuna is in fact the strongest sorcerer he's ever seen that Kashimo says in that case he'll entertain the idea, and then he decides to go fight Sukuna and therefore join the Culling Games. When Ryu and Kashimo are both up against Sukuna, they both choose the same option. Even with Sukuna's giant presence towering over Sendai Colony and Oro literally hiding away in a corner, even by Ryu's admission, this cursed energy that he's feeling was way too sweet, but he still ends up making his way to Sukuna. Even while dripping in sweat looking consumed in fear, Ryu still stands face to face with probably the strongest sorcerer he's ever encountered and tries his best to compete with Sukuna at his own table. While Satoru Gojo was as strong as he was, and even though he ended up ultimately losing against Sukuna, it doesn't stop Kashimo from taking the first opportunity in the first window he has to make his way down to the King of Curses and establish himself as Sukuna's next opponent. Just like Ryu, everyone knows that what Kashimo is rushing towards was a near-death situation, and that's even what the editor comment for the chapter is almost saying word by word. But for Kashimo, facing the sorcerer with the most potential to fulfill his desires is completely worth more than just risking his own life, because it's sorcerers that stand on Sukuna's level of power who can show Kashimo what he's not seeing. Kashimo starts his conversation with a question, and it's a question that can only be asked by those who are truly standing on another level of power in the Jujutsu world. Kashimo starts off by asking Sukuna if he was born the strongest or if he earned his title. He then asks Sukuna how to connect with others. How can he love those beneath him while knowing nothing of weakness? That's something Kashimo could never understand. His whole life he says he was surrounded by those he considered nothing more than a feeble piece of dirt. Kashimo's first question about Sukuna earning his title of the strongest is important because if Sukuna was ever weak himself, then he might not be able to understand Kashimo. Kashimo says loving those beneath him was something he could never understand, meaning Kashimo was always the strongest of his time. Having been the strongest means someone like Sukuna, who might have once in the past been able to connect with others, won't understand Kashimo's level of loneliness now. According to himself, Kashimo lived completely alone. While we can't exactly compare him to Sukuna, we can compare Kashimo to Satoru Gojo. When Satoru Gojo was born, the balance of the world itself himself changed. The level of power had shifted just by his very existence. Throughout Gojo's whole life, he was stronger than those around him. This is even reinforced by editor notes from hidden inventory that call Gojo the strongest. There was Geto who could briefly understand Gojo, but that was only when Geto and Gojo's power was somewhat comparable. After his second fight with Toji Zenin, Gojo grew so strong that he began taking on solo missions. While the gap in their power was always present, Gojo becoming as strong as he did made it harder for Geto to understand Gojo, and it even took away any reason Geto felt it was important for him to do anything for this Jujutsu world. Even Nanami said the same thing. They've all always thought to themselves that it'd be better to let Gojo handle it all, considering he's capable. Why should you try to save the world if Satoru Gojo can do it for you? And Gojo says himself he's no stranger to feeling isolated. No matter who was around him, or even if they loved and adored him, Gojo was still alone. He says that you can always admire a blooming flower, but you can't ask it to understand you. While Gojo can always push his students to greater heights and they can love Gojo in return, he can't ask them to understand him. It's a feeling of being alone that only comes with being at the peak of power. The truth is, when being that strong, you're bound to be consumed by ego and the feeling of superiority. But eventually that ego is going to set you aside in your own mind from others, and it's going to create a loneliness from the perspective that you are in fact better in every way than those beneath you. After all, being number one means to be the only one at the top. In a world where fighting with others or against others creates bonds, just like Gojo and Geto, or Yuta and Ryu, or even Yuji and Todo, it becomes harder to relate to others the stronger you grow. For Kashimo, this is an extreme case because, like I've mentioned already, he's never been able to understand others because he was always the strongest around. Whereas Gojo at least at one point had Geto because the gap in power wasn't as large. Kashimo ends his conversation with Sukuna by asking one last question. Is true strength meant to be completely alone, or if instead the endless journey that comes with the search for greater power, something the strong must walk alone? Whether that's just how it is, or if the search for someone stronger to push yourself to greater heights something you have to do alone, it doesn't change the fact that loneliness is a part of being the strongest of your generation because there's only going to be one person at the top. Both Gojo, Sukuna, and now Kashimo all know this question, but it seems like Sukuna is the only one who has the right answer. Sukuna says that both Gojo and Kashimo are the same way. They're both extremely greedy. They both fought Sukuna because of their own loneliness. If being the strongest puts you on your own journey to become even stronger, then someone else who's stronger than you are should have a better understanding considering they're already further along their own journey, which is also the same journey as you. A simpler way to say it is that Sukuna is farther down the endless road in search for greater power than either Kashimo or Gojo. From what we're told, Kashimo lived his whole life without an opponent to push him to a greater understanding. And for Kashimo, even risking death just for the opportunity to fight against somebody like Sukuna who can fulfill his desire is all he could ever want. Against Akari, while Kashimo was looking to be on the back foot momentarily, he still refused to activate his curse technique, and instead he discharged all of his cursed energy to create his own all or nothing final move on Akari, which would make him a sitting duck fresh out of cursed energy if Akari survived, all instead of releasing his curse technique. For Kashimo, death is nearly meaningless. He'd rather risk his own life against Akari just to sign himself up to die later against Sukuna, all for the greater understanding of his own self. Kashimo's curse technique is a one-time use. Once it's released, his body is gonna crumble, and as of now it's already been set in stone since the beginning of the fight. But by the end, Kashimo is finally gonna understand the journey that only comes after being the strongest around. By giving his all and finally activating his curse technique, along with giving up his own life just to power himself to a height that's capable of maybe reaching Sukuna, Kashimo will finally understand himself in a way that he couldn't in his entire lifetime. By the time Kashimo was already old, he still couldn't understand his own loneliness. Sukuna was Kashimo's last option he can see to push himself beyond his current understanding. What Sukuna did, just to be blunt, is attempt to crush Kashimo's ego and that feeling that comes with being stronger than all else around, and it's that feeling of superiority and ego that comes with strength. In that way, Kashimo understood the endless journey for greater power while also reducing his ego and therefore the loneliness he's walked over 400 years to the present day. After finally being defeated by the King of Curses, Kashimo finally begins to understand. In a mental landscape similar to what we see when Sukuna has his final conversation with Jogo, we see an older Kashimo staring into a river. Sukuna tells Kashimo that throughout his lifetime, he's probably encountered many who have given their heart and soul to challenge him, but they never did so to curse Kashimo. Instead, Sukuna says they simply wanted to be recognized. They wanted to validate who they thought themselves to be, and Kashimo responded by looking every single one of them in the eye before ending their lives. Sukuna brings back up that Kashimo asked Sukuna how he can possibly connect with others and love those beneath him, but Sukuna says that what Kashimo did for those who challenged him was the truest form of love Sukuna knows. Sukuna says he and Kashimo Kashimo are loved because they are strong, and they respond to that love in that kind of way. But because Kashimo still grieves over his solitude, it makes him all the more greedy. Kashimo is now beginning to understand a few things. Loving those beneath himself while being that strong doesn't come by forming your standard bond. It's by showing them the part of yourself that some love the most, your strength. By showing them validation or even invalidating who they once thought they were, it's the greatest form of love that you can give. We've seen Sukuna do the same for Jogo, but he doesn't doubt that Kashimo has done the same in his own lifetime for so many others. While you're always destined to walk alone at the top, Sukuna shows Kashimo how to love those beneath him. Even though Kashimo is likely gone and he wouldn't have survived anyways, he finally found the answer he traveled over 400 years to claim. Now Kashimo can die peacefully without the burden as the strongest and finally understand that he wasn't alone. Kashimo was always loving those beneath him, just in his own way.